at all. There was a doctor, some doctors, Cohn and Schoen. Now they raised this whole introduction of latent onset of diabetes, and even with autism, enterocolitis syndrome as well with the MMR vaccine. And Dr. Wakefield, in an additional study that was performed in 2001 with Scott Montgomery, and he had published this in the Adverse Drug Reaction and Toxicology Review, it again raised this whole issue of long-term latent onset of the autism enterocolitis syndrome that was related to the MMR vaccine. And that was a study that, to my understanding, was actually reviewed by 4 of the leading British authorities, and of whom had previously held positions in the regulation and licensing of medicines in the UK, and they supported that article. We find, so those are a couple examples, but I think the issue being that there is no monitoring for safety and efficacy of vaccines related to latent adverse effects that are associated with the cellular immune system. They're only looking at the antibody immune system, and that's what they do, because this is how they say, oh yes, there's a good antibody response to this vaccine, so therefore it's going to be effective. Then there's the other question, is how effective are vaccines? And this becomes a historical question, because we have to look back into time and see, look at the different statistics on the rise and fall of infectious rates in populations. And the documentation and the statistics, these go back to the 1850s. There's figures. And when I mention some of these figures to listeners, what's important to remember, even though you're going to observe, even before the vaccine was introduced to a population, there was a dramatic decrease in infectious rates and mortality rates. But put that also in the context, especially with the United States, a rapidly growing population size. To say, for example, for the pertussis mortality, going back to 1918, when there was, almost 16,000, 16,000 deaths from pertussis. By the time that the pertussis vaccine was introduced to the American population around 1948, it had decreased, let's see, I'm looking at with these charts, it decreased to approximately around 1,500. But when we look at the population increase in size from 1918 to 1948, after World War I and the mass immigration from Eastern Europe into the U.S. and from other countries, those figures even become all the more important before the introduction of pertussis.
Richard, I have the same figures and the same charts that you're working from. Here's what it shows, that virtually every single major illness that has been a cause of major suffering and death, that has a vaccine associated, the vaccine came in at the very end of that death cycle. Anywhere from 90 to 98% of the people who were dying were gone before the vaccine even came in, which means that the disease had worked itself out. There was no longer an epidemic. It was down to almost nothing. And so, therefore, to give 100% credit is wrong at every level of science and public health. It was better nutrition, more variety of nutrition, better standards of housing, cleaner water, pasteurization of milk, opening up roads to get people to be able to get into and out of the cities, not burying people in the city, not drinking straight out of the river waters, better sanitation. Remember, there's a time in England where there were no bathrooms in any houses. People would defecate in a bucket and throw it out the window. They were out in the street, and people were supposed to clean this. This meant that there were enormous amount of virins that can cause illness. People did not have clean hands, clean sanitation, clean water. And when they did get these services, when we began to see major shifts in public health initiatives, that's when people began to see a decline in these major illnesses. In fact, with the largest number of deaths in history since it was recorded after the vaccine, it was in those who were vaccinated for smallpox. in Jenner's work, the man who was considered the father of vaccination, his own son died. The young man that he was working on that was given all the credit for, look what we did, we gave this guy cowpox and then injected smallpox into his scabs into his cut arm, and lo and behold, he didn't die of smallpox. No, he became deathly ill. Many other physicians at the time were arguing that this was nonsense. There had been many people who had cowpox, got smallpox, and died of smallpox. So Jenner's entire basis was flawed, and he did not have any studies, just this one person, but he had a very rich sponsor in Parliament, and that's how he bought his medical degree. So when you look at this, it is a terrible notion of bad science. Now, we've reported on this. We have the charts up on our website. And also, we have taken the studies that show that large numbers of people, including recently, who came down with whooping cough or came down with measles, were fully vaccinated. Well, here's the issue. If you have one single child that you can show developed any form of autism from a vaccine, then you've made your point. Mm-hmm. It's like all the scientists in America and the bioengineers in America said that no human body could run faster than 4 minutes until Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, 3:58, I think it was 1958, and suddenly they were all wrong. All you have to have is one that establishes the principle, and then from that, then others expand out. So they've tried to keep this from getting out. And in a few moments, I'll show you how wrong they were by our own court's actual statements on the record. And it's interesting how Brian Deere or others cannot find the information that's a matter of official record showing the autism vaccine connection. Now, how we interpret that after it's been published is each person's prerogative. But you can't dismiss the fact that it is a connection. So now we have multiple connections between autism and environmental factors and vaccines. But they've tried their damnedest, as we know from the Simpsonwood conference, to intentionally, with malice aforethought, cover this up. How do we know? Because Robert F. Kennedy Jr., through a Freedom of Information Act, got the actual document. No one knew at the time when they were sitting around the FDA, the CDC, and the World Health Organization, and the heads of the vaccine divisions of all major manufacturers went to this North Carolina retreat and talked about, gee whiz, there's this major study that just came out, and it shows a connection between vaccination and autism. What are we going to do about it? Well, in point of fact, what they did in many people's minds is manipulating scientific data. Now, that's a federal offense. And yet, as we've seen historically, it is the interpretation of the Attorney General's office whether or not they want to choose to prosecute it or not. And we have many crimes and misdemeanors in the United States that are not prosecuted, including the lies in the United States and the lies in England that got us into these wars. And ask those journalists who've done their homework in the United Kingdom, do they believe that Tony Blair and his administration were telling the truth, or did they succumb to the manipulation or the pressure from Washington to get us into that Iraq war? The same in the United States. I don't believe that it was they got faulty intelligence. The documentation, for those of us who've done the research, shows that they created their own documentation that supported going to war, and they had every intention of going to war, and there are documents that prove that. Therefore, they are susceptible to crimes against humanity and violation of major treaties, which could mean that they could be held accountable. But you have to have someone in power who's willing to say, you are going to go to trial. Well, we don't have that. We don't have the political will, nor do we have those individuals who are willing to do it. Because if you do it against the Republicans, you're also going to have to equally do it against the Democrats. So these issues are as much political as they are economic. And but is the actual science there? And I will show in a moment that it is. I will also show that if you have people who are fully vaccinated coming down with the illness from which they were supposed to be vaccinated, then you cannot, by any measure of good science or reason, say, oh yeah, you, individual, will be safe from any harmful effects of the vaccine and you'll be protected. Now, if you doubt me, ask any physician anywhere in the world, will you sign a legal statement that if I am injured or if I'm not protected from this vaccine, you will personally pay for the damages? Let's see if any physician's willing to do that. Or better still, why don't we ask the government? If a government is willing to sign that any vaccine that we mandate any vaccine that we help support the use of, like the H1N1 or the flu vaccine, that if there's any injury, we will protect you. They have done everything possible to deny people proper access even to get covered by having artificially short deadlines. A lot of people don't fall with symptoms inside the immediate deadlines. So government's not willing to be responsible. Corporations not willing to be responsible. And where if you take a chemotherapy agent and you are sick, and you can sue the manufacturer. If you take a heart disease drug and you're sick, and you can psychiatric Prozac, you can sue. Why is it that the only people you're not allowed to sue, the manufacturers, are the vaccine companies? Because they got the political, they had the political power on their side to realize how vulnerable they were because of how bad their science was. And that is what is not being discussed. And that's where journalists self-censor. If you know, as my guest just said, Isabella Thomas, that a journalist wants to tell the truth, but what is the likelihood that they're going to go up against some official who's going to say, you shouldn't have come against us? Then you look at what you're going against. You're going against not just manufacturing companies. You're going against the most powerful corporations in the world, the wealthiest corporations in the world. Their wealth dwarfs that of ExxonMobil. You're going against the highest percentage of profit over their generic manufacturing of any product in the world. You're also going against those companies that have been smart enough to create front groups, foundations, think tanks. They then hire people, including consultants, of which there are over 44,000 consultants in Washington alone, that are former legislators or former National Institutes of Health directors. We've seen the revolving door, people going from the FDA into the pharmaceutical industry. Not just that, but going in to head their vaccine division. So that means that they know who they can rely upon to be a team player and all speak with the same voice. Vaccines are safe and effective. There is no connection between vaccines and autism. And yet, the science shows just the opposite. Any thoughts from you on this before we go back to our fine panel and I give my final summation?
Just a couple of examples, just so the listeners can have a kind of a greater appreciation. Centers of Disease Control, it's their own data from the MMWR, a study 2006 looking at the mumps outbreak in Iowa. 92% of those among those that contracted mumps, 92% were vaccinated, 8% unvaccinated. 2004 in Journal of Pediatrics, a similar study done in Oregon for the chickenpox outbreak statewide. 86 were vaccinated that contracted the smallpox, while only 14% were not. And of course, there's the issue that there may be more people being vaccinated. Pertussis, this was an Ohio 2008 study from CDC official surveillance data. For pertussis, 90% were vaccinated that came down with pertussis, while 10% were unvaccinated. And just one more for measles outbreak, looking through Texas, this is a little earlier in the 87 New England Journal of Medicine, 99% of those who contracted measles were vaccinated, only 1% unvaccinated. So that kind of, I think those kind of figures kind of would lay the efficacy ideology to rest. Okay, Gary?
Yes, sorry, just lost a connection. Okay, now, I thank you for that, Richard. Now, before we go to our final wrap-up of our panelists, and I will ask people in this audience who have suggestions, thoughts on what we've been doing and what is one of the longest radio special investigative reports in American history, to call us. I'm going to give you our 800 number now. So anywhere in North America you can call. 888-874-4888. 888-874-4888. I want to thank the people who are standing by. We have people from all over the world, according to our research right now online. All of our panelists are standing by. Now for my own closing thoughts on this. And by the way, we have tremendous amount of documentation on vaccineinitiative.com, progressiveradionetwork.com, and GaryNull.com. Central to the latest claims by the gentleman I had on, journalist Brian Deere, published in the British